So welcome to this week's Pivot Chat. I do not have an interviewee today. It's just me. You get me, only me. We're talking about truths and myths today about pivoting. And I really want to offer to you, no matter whether so this is a conversation for you. If you're going through a pivot, this is a conversation for you. If you've ever gone through a pivot, maybe to give yourself a little bit more grace and understanding and hindsight around how far you've come and the pivots that you've already gone through. But I also want you to hear me if you plan to stay in business in the future, which I hope and think are all of you, going to happen again. And I don't say that to scare you. I freaking love pivots. I love change. I think they are such beautiful opportunities. And so much of my message with these pivot chats and with just my work in general is to normalize this experience and to help you sort of soften along the way so that your pivots can be what I actually think they are intended to be, which is simply a moment of change and transformation, whether it's something small or something big, that on the end, that the end result or the external manifestation of your pivot is something really big, or whether it's something really small, it really doesn't matter. We go through some of the same processes along the way. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm specifically going to talk about some myths that I have noticed over the years of my own pivots and transitions and changes in life, in business, and for sure, patterns and things that I've seen in my clients and just sort of the way the human brain works. And I'm really, I'm talking about myths and truths today, but they all kind of, many of them boil down to one. So I'm going to talk about one big myth today. And for sure, there are lots of conversations, lots of pivot chats episodes I could devote to a truth or a myth. And so I'm gonna talk about them sort of more broadly, because again, I think it all kind of boils down to one thing, what we're going to be talking about today. And then there's some sort of like sub myths underneath that I want to share. So, I think so often that oftentimes, actually, I'm going to talk about a little sub myth, and then I'm going to bring it back up to the main one that I want to talk about today. A conversation I've had with a lot of people, one, because I have put these pivot chats out into the world and people are interested in being guests, and I love that. And I've been having interesting conversations with people as we've, explored whether or not to bring them on here as a guest, and if so, what that message would be, and what their story can help you as the audience to learn or take away from. And it's been interesting, I think, to notice how people define a pivot to begin with, right? So I think so many people are really clear. I think many people define pivots. I'll give you a few examples. I think many people agree that a pivot is something that happens when somebody leaves a former career and starts a business, right? Everybody who started a business, I would argue, has pivoted. Even if, you were in the same industry doing the exact same work before when you worked for someone else, and you just quote unquote, just pivot, do a small thing to start a business. If you simply pivoted and started your own business, that's actually still quite a pivot, and takes, what I care about is less about the external pivot, like how it manifests in the external world, and how, again, like the headline, right? So I left this career, or I left this employee-employer relationship, and I started my own business. What's really the same, and what's most important to me, and what I help people with, is what's the internal process that happens to get you there? Because that's simply just the headline, right? Oh, I started my own business, right? And those of you who've been in business for more than 5 minutes know that just simply starting your own business doesn't mean that, like, okay, like the journey's over. I decided to start my own business. Like, here we are, and everything's, rainbows, unicorns, puppy dogs, and waterfalls for the rest of our lives. Like, no, the journey has just begun. And so I'm so much more interested in pivot chats, is so much more about the internal process that that is underneath our pivots. The pivot is just the opportunity, excuse me, to learn, and the opportunity to dive deep into what it is that we're creating next, or how it is that we're being called to show up next, or however you want to say that. And so what I find so often, let me back up. So I think a lot of people agree that like pivoting to start a business is a pivot, right? And by the way, you can define pivoting however you want, but I really want to start talking about the kinds of pivots that people aren't talking about. So that's a pivot that a lot of people are clear about. A lot of people have that on their About Me section, right? There's so much power in pivoting to start a business. And that's not really what Pivot Chats is about. I may at some point have some sort of sub-series dedicated to that. But what I'm more interested in is, well, what happens in the happily ever after, right? After you get married, what happens then? You have a marriage. What happens when you start a business? Great, you pivoted to start a business, great. But what happens then? And what happens then is so often not talked about. And that's what Pivot Chats is about. I want to talk about what this experience is as an entrepreneur, doing work you love, and what that creative experience is like. So a lot of people agree, right, that running a business or starting a business, excuse me, is a pivot. I think a lot of people agree that, or define pivot in the same way when we're talking about, let's just use the pandemic as an example. Lots and lots of businesses were, I'm going to just use a really strong word here, forced to pivot as a result of the pandemic for obvious reasons. And those were really big sort of environmental factor that really shook the foundation of a lot of businesses. And I think that's an example of, I always kind of like to look at change in two ways. Like there's change that happens to you, and that I know that sounds very victim-y, and I don't actually believe that like our lives happen to us. I think we are sort of co-creative with the universe or our environment or our communities, however you want to look at that. Topic for another day. But however you look at that, again, let's just oversimplify it for a second. There's change that happens that we respond to, like a pandemic. And then there's change that sort of comes through us. There's change that is almost of us. And I often call these creative pivots, right? So when I often use this example, when I started my business out as a hypnotherapist, I pivoted eventually, actually fairly quickly in relative terms, but I pivoted to not only calling myself a coach, but to not working with my clients in a hypnotic state, and to only coaching my clients, quote unquote, and to really coaching them, to really working with them in a way that best suited my style as I evolved as a practitioner. And really brought together my background of consulting and working in corporate, where I was really a coach without that title, and the hypnotherapy training that I had. I really, at the end of the day, it looks like I dropped the hypnotherapy, but what I did is just sort of bring it into the masses of my skill set and my awareness, and sort of created a style that was all my own based on all of my training, not just one modality of my training. So I think when we think about that, that was more of a creative pivot, right? Like my work evolved. I evolved as a practitioner, and you better believe that the people I was working with were evolving, meaning, yes, of course they were evolving because we do transformational work together, but the clients and the client avatar and the types of people and the types of audiences that I was working with started to shift as I shifted and evolved over time. And all of us sort of, all of the things, me on an internal basis, me as a practitioner, me as a business owner, sort of making decisions, and then my clients or potential clients, my audience started to shift as well, and all of that really aligned together. So I really feel like that is more of what I've been calling lately a creative pivot, and I think there's a lot of opportunity in the creative pivot. And by the way, there's a ton of opportunity in the change that happens to you too, right? But I do encourage you to think about your pivots from multiple perspectives. And one is this change that's coming through me? Or is this change that is, and again, I don't love this way of saying it, but change that is happening to me, or change that is happening in my environment that I'm choosing to respond to, because you, by the way, could choose not to respond, right? If you had a restaurant during COVID, you could have chosen to, I guess, try to stay open, and it wouldn't have worked, right? Or you could have tried to, not follow the rules of your region or your state or your province or whatever. And, but you could have, that's still a choice. Neither here nor there. And so what I really want to sit with here is like this idea of like, are you even in a pivot? Oftentimes that's something that I bring to my clients, or that's something that I highlight for them and bring their awareness to, that they may or may not even be aware of, is that I'll say oftentimes, like, you're in a transition, right? And not to say that like my clients aren't smart and they can't figure this out themselves. This is something that I often need my coach to say to me from time to time, because when we're in a transition, when we're in a pivot, whatever you want to call it, when we're in the midst of change, we oftentimes don't give ourselves enough credit, or we aren't thinking about the fact that we're in a change process all the time. We're not thinking about it from that perspective all the time. And so we sort of expect of ourselves to be able to operate normally. And you can't when you're in a transition, meaning doesn't mean that you can't also like do your life and go through a creative pivot in your business. But we expect ourselves, when we go, okay, something needs to change, we just for some reason expect ourselves to know what that is and to instantly do it, and for it to be back to like business as usual. And that's not realistic, because that's just not how life works, and that's not how business works, and that's not how change works. But oftentimes we don't even remember or take into account for ourselves, to let ourselves off the hook most of the time, that we are in a transition, that we are in the middle of change, that we are in a pivot. And so I really want to normalize even all of the ways that you could pivot. I just recorded one of our episodes that'll be coming out later with someone who really spoke really beautifully about her transition and her pivots and her evolution as a practitioner, and how her work has changed over time because she has evolved as a practitioner. And then as she sort of added modalities or deepened her work in a certain area, she realized, okay, this now I want to serve people in this environment because of the way that this modality is supporting my clients. And so she's evolved over time, making these little, as she uses the term, refinements. And so I want to offer that like a small refinement to your business can also be considered a pivot. And while it doesn't really matter what you call it, it's not about like, we're not in business school here, and we're not like, writing down, is this a pivot? Is this a pivot? Yes, no, it's not about that. But when we aren't aware of the internal process of what happens in a pivot, and we're considering the changes that we're making in our business to not be a pivot or to not be a transition, then we oftentimes don't give ourselves enough space to go through whatever internal process requires us to get there. Because some of our changes that we make are very obvious, and it just sort of, oh, I feel like I want to do this now, and we just do it. And while that could be a pivot on the outside, that's not a huge pivot on the inside, right? The way that I just described that. But if you are going through something where you are feeling like your work isn't lighting you up in the way that it used to, go back to Pivot Chat number 1 with Allison Delator, where she talked about she is an animal communicator and an intuitive coach. And she noticed that even though she started her business out as an animal communicator, and that is the thing that she is most known for, that is still a big piece of her business, is to do animal communication sessions. She's a powerful intuitive. She noticed that, and she's for several years now offered intuitive coaching, but she noticed that basically the fulfillment levels that she was getting had started to shift, and she doesn't want to do as many as much animal communication work as she does want to do coaching. And so she's, at the end of the day, the outside version is that she's just changing the ratio of the work that she does. She just wants to do a little bit more of a balance, or a little bit more focus, actually a little bit more focus on the coaching, and a smaller amount of focus and attention and time on the animal communication. But that was a deep internal process for her to go through to get to that answer. And had she not given herself the time and space to say, something's changing, I must be going through a little pivot or a little transition or a little refinement, right? Or a change, whatever you want to call it. When we give ourselves the ability, when we take a minute and take into account and are aware of, I am in transition. So I'm going to treat this as a transition. I'm going to actually give it some intention and some space and some attention. We can flow through it so much easier. And so all of that is to say, going back to the myths of pivoting, I want to offer to you that I think sometimes the myth, and this isn't how we typically talk about myths, but I think oftentimes the mentality that we have is that what we're going through isn't a pivot, isn't a transition, isn't really a change. And so therefore, my favorite, there's something wrong with us, right? So if we're not acknowledging it as a pivot or a transition because it's something small, or, or we just, something feels off and we don't know what feels off. So then we're not actually maybe giving ourselves credit for being in a pivot, because we don't even know what we're going to pivot to. We don't even know what we're going to change. And so it's almost like we don't give ourselves credit for being in a pivot when we don't give it the credit it's due. We miss out on giving ourselves the space to create intention around it, to focus on it, to let ourselves off the hook. Because if you don't know where you're going, that's okay. But to expect yourself to know where you're going when you're at the beginning of a pivot is really not fair. So I really want to acknowledge those of you going through a pivot. I want you to go back. If you're not going through a pivot right now, go back in time and let me know, go back in time and think about this and let me know. Have you, when was it along the path that you realized you were in a pivot? And I bet 9 times out of 10 people go, oh yeah, I realized it 5 minutes later. Or I realized it 5 months later, or I realized it 5 weeks later, or 5 days later. You kind of start the pivot and then you start the awareness. And oftentimes the awareness lags so far behind that we really, I think there can be suffering in a pivot. And I think we don't have to suffer. Again, I don't think that pivots are simple and easy, rainbows, unicorns, and puppy dogs. But I think we can alleviate unnecessary suffering by removing the proverbial second arrow, by not judging ourselves, and by effectively giving ourselves credit, and effectively, I'm going to say this word, judging ourselves. In other words, looking at ourselves from the truth of our situation, which is, oh gosh, something is changing. Oh, it's okay that I don't know where I'm going next exactly. Oh, it's okay that I feel something needs to change and I don't know what it is. Michelle says, it's taken me 5 years to discover what I really wanted to do in my business. Though I'm making big changes, I'm excited, even though I've halted past activity. Absolutely. And so I think, Michelle, your comment comes in at a beautiful time. Thank you. It's almost like I planted this your comment as a segue, because the overarching myth that we're sort of just approaching here today is this myth of that you're doing it wrong. And I think one of the sub-myths under that is that you're doing it wrong because you're not in a pivot when you actually are, or you're doing it wrong. You're feeling like you're doing entrepreneurship wrong because you're not giving yourself credit for the fact that you're actually in a pivot. And when you start to look at yourself from the perspective of, oh, I'm just in a pivot, I'm just in a transition, I'm just going through some change, sometimes that alone will start to give us we'll start to let ourselves off the hook when we can look at our situation in truth and just say, oh, I'm in a transition. That's why this feels a little confusing. I've not lost my mind. I still know how to run my business. I just am going through a little something here, right? And then we can stop expecting ourselves to operate business as usual, as we used to say in corporate, and to start to recognize that we're in the middle of something. And so one of the things, thank you, Michelle, one of the other sub-myths that I want to talk about here is this idea that, you know, oh, I pivoted to start my business, but I'm not really supposed to pivot after that. Or I think there is a, well, let me state, I'm going to actually state this myth. So I think there's a myth out there that pivoting is for people starting businesses, like you pivot into a business, like I said, or pivoting is for people in their first year or two in business and they're still trying to figure it out. And so I really want to normalize this. This is a really, really big one. A lot of my clients will tell me, and I've been in business for 5 years. Michelle, who's joining us live, has been in business for 5 years. And most of my clients have been in business for 5 years or more. I often attract clients that have been in business for longer than I have. And so what I find so interesting, and I really want to normalize for all of you, is those people who've been in business for a long time will often feel like something's wrong with them when they start to pivot, because either they're not aware that they're pivoting or transitioning, or they just feel like, geez Louise, I should have had this figured out by now. And so what I'm here to tell you from the truth is that pivoting is not a new business owner experience. And I would argue most of the new business owner pivoting, and that, like, everybody's different, but let's just argue for argument's sake, first year or two in business, people that pivot in those moments are oftentimes still finding sort of what they want to do. And Michelle is saying it's taken her 5 years to feel like she's discovered what she really wants to do. And I would argue, Michelle, that so along the way, it's not like each of the phases, each of the evolutions of your work has felt, wrong, but you've just evolved over this time, right? So anyway, all that is to say, I think there is a type of pivot that's very common for new business owners. And I think there is a period of time where we go through that. Sometimes the first business we start isn't the one we stay with for a longer term. But it doesn't matter, and everybody's experience is unique and different and valid, and there's no wrong way to run a business. There's no right way to run a business. There's no right way to do work that you love. It is a creative process. And so I hear this so often, though, from business people who've been in business for even longer than I have, but anywhere around whatever time frame you think to yourself, and this is also what we put on ourselves, like, oh, well, I've been in business X number of years, therefore I should have fill in the blank. I should have figured this out by now. I shouldn't have to change my marketing strategy. I shouldn't keep changing. I should have landed on something by now. I'm changing my mind again. All of these sort of things that we tell ourselves when we're in a pivot to really, frankly, like, this is our way, I think, are very helpful brains trying to distract us and trying to make us wrong. That's just the brain doing the brain job to tell us, like, because change ain't safe, y'all. Change is not safe for your brain. It is safe, but the brain does not think so. And so you're going to be a human and you're going to have these thoughts. All I'm trying to do here is to just let your brain know that, and you know that these are just myths. These are just things your brain's going to tell you. They're not actually true. And so I really want to normalize this concept of, like, Michelle, I love your word. I feel like I'm just evolving. I had a group coaching program a couple of years ago that I called Evolve, because I really believe in this idea that we are meant, for those of us who are entrepreneurs, we are meant to keep evolving, or anything that you're doing in your career, whatever you're doing, if it feels heart-centered and meaningful to you. You're not meant to just find this work and do it and keep doing it in the exact same way with the exact same kinds of people, with the exact same messages in your content till the end of time. Most entrepreneurs I know are creatives, I think creating a business is starting a business is a creative experience. It's a creative endeavor. And I think running a business is actually a creative process. And people like to look at running a business like fill in the formula, get the perfect marketing, whatever, and then you've got it. And I just don't see business that way. I very much don't see life that way. But we have these messages, right, in our society that want to tell us there's a certain right way and a certain wrong way. And so if you're pivoting and you feel somewhere in there that you're not doing it right, or something's wrong with you, even that you can't get this right, or that you don't know where you're going next, or that you're not doing this particular pivot right, that's what today is about. You are. Because there is no right way. There's just your way. And if you're in a pivot, if you're in a transition, you are 100% evolving. You are in the middle of a creative process. And creative processes, when we really let ourselves off the hook and start to look at these pivots and transitions and just running a business in general, living a life you love, doing work you love, all of these things are creative processes. I find that when I remind myself, because I have to remind myself of this too, when I remind myself that this is a creative process, it's like I let myself off the hook from having some expectation of it needing to be a certain way, or needing to look a certain way, or needing to feel a certain way. And I start to let myself off the hook around what I'm supposed to be doing. And I think the blessing and the annoying thing is, like, there is no one thing you're supposed to be doing. There are people that are going to tell you, that there's a right way and a wrong way to run a business. And that might be true for them. And I hold space for all truths here. But I think that when we really look at us as souls, at the end of the day, we are all unique individuals. And so how can it be that there is only one way, or a right way and a wrong way to do anything, when there are so many unique beings of us out there? So many different businesses out there. I have a business coach, and we have some very similar business models, and we run our business very different ways because we're two different humans. And you better believe that we pivot in different ways. One of the things that I've been asking some of my pivot chat guests is, what's your tell? How do you know when you're pivoting? Because we all, and I encourage you to ask yourself that. If you're not sure, or in your, like, one of your earlier pivots and you haven't gone through this as much, you might want to listen to some of the episodes and see what my guests are saying, because they're all answering this question a little bit differently, because we're all unique. And so some of them might help you to find some of your clues that you've got this, like, little radar detector of, like, ooh, that might mean I'm about to start a pivot, or that might mean I'm in a transition. When I start to get distracted in this way, or when I start to, for me, I often feel things in my body. Or for me, oftentimes it'll be a dip. One of, I think, a lot of people's pivot signs that it's coming is, like, I'll start to feel a dip in fulfillment. Something in my work that used to light me up won't light me up quite as much. And it can just be a 1%, 10% shift. But that's actually pretty big when you're really lit up in your work. And so it's just something to pay attention to. It doesn't mean that you have to have everything perfect, but what are your tells? And so much of what I've created pivot chats, why I've created pivot chats, is because I want to normalize this experience. I want to normalize this experience because we are evolving. And if you are doing work that you love, if you are doing I don't love to use, like, purpose, because I think I got myself wrapped. I don't like to use the term purpose, because when I was trying to find the work that I wanted to do in the world, I really prefer using the word my life's work. But even that can throw people sometimes. when I was on my journey to find this work, I thought something was wrong with me, because I see all these people out there doing these things that they're really gifted at and that they really love. And I just hadn't quite found that yet. And when I would listen to podcasts or watch interviews with famous people talk about their work, I got very envious. And I remember feeling like, wow, they clearly have this big, huge purpose and mission. And like, I don't know what mine is. And so I really don't love to use the word purpose. So I'm going to use a few words so that you can sort of resonate with whichever one speaks to you, because I don't believe we all have one purpose. Otherwise, I've led a purposeless life for 40 years. And then when I was 41, I think I started this business. So then I started living in purpose. No, that's not true. And I actually loved so much of my former career. Anyway, so if you're doing work that you love, if you are doing work that is in your purpose, if you are working in your zone of genius, if you're doing work that's like taking your gifts and talents and taking them out into the world in like with the biggest level of potential, and you're impacting the world in the way that only you can, if you're doing your life's work, you better believe you're on a creative journey. And so who's to say this beautiful gift that you have, however you put it out into the world, who's to say that there's like a right way and a wrong way to do that? And I would argue, who's to say, for many of us, who's to say that there's only one way that's going to feel great to us? That's why so many of us have more than one business sometimes at a time. And sometimes we start a business and then we close that one and start a second business. Sometimes we start a business and then we start a podcast. Sometimes we start a business and then we write a book, right? There's an infinite number of things you can do with your life's work. And I don't believe most of us are not meant to do just one thing that looks like a copy paste forever. I go back to my dad. He's retired now, but he was an attorney at the same law firm. He was an attorney at the same law firm for 33 years before he retired. And so on the outside, the dude was an attorney. He didn't have any other career. He was always an attorney. He was an attorney at the same law firm. It's very easy from the outside to think that this man didn't go through any pivots. And while they didn't look that big from the outside, he practiced like 3, 4, 5 different types of law, focused on one at the beginning of his career. And then after maybe, I'm making this up, 10 years or so, he focused on a different element of law. Some of it was driven by the people he was working with, and some of the attorneys that were his mentors that he loved to work with, they were doing this kind of thing. And so he was like, well, I want to keep working with them. So I'm going to go into that area of law. And sometimes he was driven by what he was most interested in at this phase in his career. And in the end, he actually did a lot of like leadership development for the firm, and had a slightly internal role. And so he had several different iterations of his gift, of his magic, as it played out based on his creativity, based on who he wanted to work with that moment, based on which types of clients were coming to him for what they were coming to him for. So let's not underestimate what pivots really are, and let's not underestimate what this journey is that you're on. And it doesn't even mean you don't even have to have an entrepreneur, have a business to be on this journey. I think our lives are creative processes. I think we're always constantly evolving. And so just like sometimes you might feel like it's time to move to a different place, or you might feel like, whether it's move to a different geographic location or just move to a different home, that feeling, that movement is a pivot, however you want to define it. So if you think you're doing it wrong, if you think there's something, if you're judging yourself in any way, right? There's I think it's like a Sufi legend about the second arrow. So I'll spare you the details, but the first arrow is the pain of the thing that you're experiencing, right? So you're going through a pivot and it feels sort of messy, it's confusing. We'll talk about the messy middle in another episode. But let's say that you're going through that. That's the first arrow. You've already got that. And that's actually the meat and potatoes of what you're dealing with and what really needs your attention and intention. When we judge ourselves around how we're dealing with the first arrow, that's like a second arrow. So now you've been, quote unquote, shot with two arrows, right? So A, the suffering is deeper. B, the stuff that has to be done is more. And you're just making it harder on yourself. And again, no judgment for the self-judgment. I always say, let's not throw a third arrow in the mix, but this is all about normalizing what this experience is like. And so if you're judging yourself for not doing this pivot thing right, my friends, there is no right way to do it. So take the grading, stop giving yourself an F or a C- and give yourself an A+, because if you're still in this body and you're still in this business and you're still showing up for whatever it is that you do in whatever form it takes next, you get an A+. Let's release that second arrow. Let's recognize that we're all going through pivots and transitions all the time in life, in business. And yes, there are 100% of the time isn't also a season for keeping things the same, for not changing, for integrating changes and allowing those things to just become a business as usual. And I really, really fight for that too. That's a whole nother episode for a whole nother time. But when we're going through a change, if you can stop making yourself wrong, it's easier said than done. But just reminding yourself that this is a creative process, I find sometimes is the piece that we all need to just let that go. So thank you for listening. Thank you for joining me. I hope that this has been helpful. I will be sharing more. There are so many more myths I have found to the pivoting process and to just how people think that change is supposed to be. And I really, really want to keep coming out here and normalizing this experience. If you have a question, if you have an insight that you'd like to share with me, feel free to send me a private message, especially if you have a topic related to pivots that you've been experiencing that maybe you don't want to share with me live, or that you are wondering about in your own pivots. I always feel that, like, if one person has a question or is grappling with something, then it's something that would benefit multiple people. So I know that you're not the only one grappling with that question or that topic. And I'm happy to create an episode just for you for that topic. I have millions already listed for myself and planned out for you, but I am always happy to use to take your question and to use an episode to give you that answer, or to give you my thoughts. I don't know that there is an answer, but to give you my thoughts on how you might approach it differently. So thank you, Michelle. Michelle says glad she could jump on. Thanks for all your wisdom. You're so welcome. Lovely, lovely to see you. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. Wherever you are in time listening to this, take a moment for some gratitude, take a moment to appreciate. Let's just use pivots as an example. Take a moment to appreciate all the times that you've trusted yourself and had the courage to move forward in whatever way felt right to you. That, I think, when you can remind yourself of those moments when you've done it in the past, because we've all gone through changes in our lives. If we're still here on the planet and you're older than like 3 years old, you've probably gone through some sort of pivot before. So reminding yourself that it already has been done. You've already done it successfully, and you're going to do it again. Taking some time for that gratitude is always a good call. So here's your reminder for that. And I'll see you next week with another pivot chat. Take care.